Thanks very much. Well, thank you very much. My gain might be a little bit high there. So it's, yeah, so I won't actually be showing you any flying robots, unfortunately. I'll be talking about embedded optimization, which I'll tell you what it is, in smart systems and products. And this is, I was helped by several students and former students. Those are the ones listed there. So the style of the talk, the first thing is, well, it's for the public. Now, by the way, here's a hint. If you have one of these, you're not a member of the public, right? So anyway, so or if you have one of those, you can just pretend you're a member of the public. So it's going to be completely non-technical. Actually, it's a lie there. There is one equation. It's coming up. Yeah, but I think it's in a font no one can read, so I think it's okay. So it's going to be non-technical, the talk, just so you know what you're up against. The focus is actually going to be on ideas. So what are the ideas of optimization? How do you use it? How do people use it? Where is it used? How does it fail? This kind of stuff. These are the ideas. Another way to say that is it's not going to be entertaining, right? So when Danny called me and said, could you do this? I said, why on earth would you ask me to do this? There's people who can show you like super cool things with like have robots fly over your head, videos and things like that. That would be fantastic. And I presume those people just said no. And here I am. But I don't know. I don't know what happened. But just so you've been warned now, you know, it's not going to be entertainment. But there are going to be ideas. That's the entire point, actually. So, okay. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'll start by saying what a smart system is. Oh, I should also, since I know that there are a number of people with these who are not members of the public, I'm going to have a blanket apology. Actually, I don't really apologize, but just this talk is not for you. And so I will talk about things where in the audience we have experts and they'll be cringing. This may not be you, but it could be if you see someone next to you cringing, it's probably because they're an expert about what I'm talking about at that time, and they're horrified. So it's fine. You don't have to call the medics or so. Well, you may actually, but okay. So I'll start by just talking about, you know, what are these smart systems? Then what I'll do is I'll talk about optimization, which I think is sort of at the center of a lot of these kinds of things. I mean, by the way, there's other points of view. This is just my point of view. Other people would say, you know, machine learning is at the center, or something else is at the center. Then I'm going to talk about this idea of recourse, which is to take actions after you know some more information, and that's basically what this conference is about. It's control, which is recourse. And then I'll finish up with some, you know, summaries, interesting observations, and things you should be terrified about, and that kind of stuff. Okay. So what's a smart system? Well, the idea is a smart system is something that uses, you know, some sophisticated mathematical algorithm. It runs on one or more computers or devices. It could run on your phone. It could run in a device you didn't even know had a computer in it. It could run in the cloud or something like that. But the idea is it's something that runs on one or more computers, and generally speaking uses a lot of data. And what it does is it makes real-time decisions. So that's the idea. So that's what a smart system is, right? So we'll look at some examples just to get the idea of what these would be. And again, for people who really know about these topics, they'll understand that I'm butchering it, but it's fine. Okay, so the idea, let's look at an example. It's like electrical power generator dispatch, right? So what happens, for example, in California is between like, you know, midnight and 2 a.m. every night. What happens is a bunch of generators, like 3,100 generators in California, are scheduled for the next day in 15-minute increments. And that means you decide which generators are going to be on and how much power they're going to be generating. So that's generator dispatch. And this is done so that you can, of course, cover the predicted demand, right? I mean, that's the critical part. Now, that's just predicted demand. That's not the actual demand tomorrow. And the goal is to minimize total cost. That's the cost of generation. So some generators are cheap to run. Others are much more expensive. Of course, you have to respect, in this plan that you're making for the next day, you have to be able to make sure, you have to respect the limits on transmission lines, right? So if a transmission line has a certain capacity, you can't go over it. And you need to have you have to have contingency plans ready to go so that if something fails, usually a list of various things of possible, big failures would occur. You have a way to work around it, and in 10 minutes, have California up and running again. So that's the idea. This is sort of this is the goal. Okay. So just a quick picture is on the left. You see, generators in the U.S. with the size of the circle telling you something about the capacity. And if you look on the right, you'll see a picture of some of California's, 4,000 major transmission lines, right? So this is the idea. And that's used to move the electricity around from one place to another. Right? So this is what it looks like. It's an open website. You just go to California ISO. That's the independent system operator. They're the ones that do all this calculation and decide what generator should be on. You can go there. And what this will show is a couple of things. This shows for some day, maybe last week. One of these curves is the prediction. I think the purple one is the prediction made midnight the night before. And actually, it's pretty good. I mean, it's within a couple of % of what the real demand is. I think this snapshot was taken right at this time, and the blue shows what the actual demand is, right? So it's pretty good. It's a couple of %, but this is sort of the idea. Okay. Another example is a quantitative trading engine. Right? And actually part of the theme here is that there are going to be examples and applications in widely different fields that just evoke completely different ideas from people, right? So if you think about electricity generation, you should think of like giant turbines and, high voltage lines and big, powerful stuff. Trading engine? Well, I guess you should think you should think about somebody co-locating a server next to a trading engine, right? But you don't think about big turbines and things like that. So in a quantitative trading engine, this might be used by a hedge fund or something like that. You might do something on a minute-by-minute basis, hour-by-hour, even second-by-second or millisecond-by-millisecond basis. What you do is you determine what trades to make. So you decide what you're going to trade. And your goal is you roughly want to maximize expected return. How much do you think you can make, and if you did it for a while, how much you would eventually make. And you might have things like risk limits and leverage limits. So you want the probability of your value dropping by 30% to be relatively small, for example. Okay. And there might be legal limits on what you can do depending on the hedge fund and so on. And here you'd be using current estimates of returns, risks, and transaction costs, right? Oh, by the way, I'll talk about these different areas, and it'll actually turn out that people who work in these different areas actually often have no idea how closely related they are, right? So I guarantee you I could get a hedge fund person and someone working on power engineering, and actually it's not even clear they could even speak to each other at all. Actually, they probably wouldn't want to speak to each other, but that's another story that we'll come back to that a bit later. Okay. So this is, if you do quantitative trading, this is the goal. I mean, this is very simple. This is what you want. I think this is actually real. So it's from a former student of mine at a hedge fund. So, this is some year where the S&P is down, quite a bit. We could probably guess what year it is. And that would be the value of the fund. And you can see it doesn't always go up. There's times when it goes down. But, you finish the year quite impressively, right? So that's the goal, right? And so how do you do that? That's what I'm going to talk about. Okay, another example. This one doesn't even involve an action. Well, it's a very minimal action. Spam filter. So spam filter is this. You have an email comes in, and then you look at attributes of it. For example, where did it come from, right? Then you ask questions like, you have things like word counts. That would be how many times, a dictionary of words occurred in that email. By the way, most of the time, that's 0, but for some words, it might be more, and so something like that. And then you have questions like, is the sender in your address book? And the idea then is very quickly, like within a second or even less, what you decide is you guess whether or not that's spam. If it's spam, you flag it or even just confidently put it into a junk folder, right? So that's the idea. Okay. Here's a picture, and I would think a person can look at this and quickly figure out that this is spam. But the point is actually machines do it, and actually right now machines do it. In particular, Gmail does it better than human beings do. Okay, so, and that's coming. A lot of these things are moving that way. They're better than people. So, that doesn't mean they're 100% better. They're not always better, but Statistically, they're better. So, okay. So there's a ton of applications. I'm going to talk about a couple of them, but I'll just mention a couple just so you realize that this is a very big and wide set of applications, right? So engine control. In a modern engine, 100 or maybe a couple hundred times a second, things like fuel injection timing is being adjusted. All the time, that's happening. That's, you turn the engine on, this is happening, okay? So people here who do this kind of stuff, these people, know that, right? But in fact, this is the idea. So that's just happening constantly. You have like a hybrid vehicle, right? So there's a smart system embedded in that. And the question, of course, there is maybe 10 times a second you decide, should the engine turn off? Should it turn on? If it turns on, what power should I run it at? And the reason is this, you have choice. You can get your energy required either from the battery or from your engine. And how should that happen? By the way, if you do a bad job at that, you get low mileage. And if you do a good job, you're going to do very well. Things like a recommendation engine and search engines work this way. So these are things that collect a lot of data, run fancy algorithms, and then they recommend things to you. Things like online advertising works this way. A mathematical model is made of what, a person's likes and dislikes. Specifically, what's estimated is like whether you'll click on an ad or actually buy something, and then very quickly, choices of what ads to show you or what specials to offer you or these kinds of things is done. Things like a flight management system. I mean, you can program one up, and an airplane will basically fly from Logan to San Francisco. There's a few things it won't do, but basically it'll do just fine. It'll go through a programmed set of waypoints. It'll execute flawless turns. It'll do its descent. It'll come down and land. By the way, I'm not recommending that you do this, but it'll actually, technically it'll do it, right? So you have automated real-time fraud detection. So in these applications, every time you make a Visa card purchase or a credit card purchase, various attributes of that purchase, like location, time, what is the amount, what is the category, like what is it? Is it a meal or something like that? That goes to something which very quickly, within a second, looks at it, figures out, makes a guess. Is it for real? If it's not for real, if it's not, actually it makes three-way guess. It either says, that's not real and I'm stopping that transaction, or it says, that's real, let it go ahead, or a middle one bounces it to a human being who looks at it more carefully. And then they're the one who presses the red or the green button, right? So, okay. Supply chain system. That's another one. So a supply chain is when products are being moved from factories and stuff like that. Here's an example there is, right now, I absolutely guarantee you, there are products being shipped to Amazon fulfillment centers outside Boston. Right now, these are products no one has ordered yet. No one. And they're arriving at these fulfillment centers right now. And the reason is they have very sophisticated algorithms that are predicting, so it could be, in fact, some of us, what we're going to order. And they're making sure it's there. Actually, of course, if they're wrong, I mean, the worst thing that happens is it comes in 2 days, not 1 day. But this is the idea, okay? So these things are all around you. Actually, a lot of these things you don't know about, and actually that's the way they should be, in fact, for most of these things, right? Revenue management. That's a euphemism. That's a euphemism for companies trying to extract as much money as they possibly can from you. So that's what it is, right? So, but it's a pretty good euphemism, I think, right? So it was kind of pioneered by some people up the street from Stanford. So something I'm not proud of from Stanford. Anyway, so that's it. And by the way, this is why if you get on an airplane, and the seat next to you, someone could be sitting there who paid like 1/8 what you paid. Or at least that's how it usually works for me. So this is and you wonder, how do they do these things? It's not casual, okay? It's done very seriously. It's not, some casual thing where somebody said, oh, I don't know, let's release some more seats. It's done very, very specifically, using the types of things I'm going to talk about. Things like image and speech recognition. These things you see all the time now, right? This is part of self-driving cars. There's unbelievable stuff going on in this area. I'm not going to say much about it because it's a bit more complicated, but it's the same thing. It's based on exactly the same ideas I'm going to talk about today. So the main thing about all these is they're in wildly different fields, right? That's actually kind of the interesting part. Most people who work on one of these probably couldn't even talk to someone in another field. I mean, some could, but very few. They all speak their own weird little dialect and stuff like that. And so it's actually, what's interesting is that there's a common framework that all of these applications use. So I think that's the interesting part. Okay, so now I'll tell you what the talk is about. It's about this. How do these things work? And I'm going to take you down to a 5,000-foot view, and that was not chosen casually, right? At 30,000 feet, you don't see anything, right? It's just a blur. We're not going to go low. At 5,000, you can start seeing some ideas and some structures. You know, are you going to come out? Are you going to be able to get a job in data science after? No. But I'll take you down, and I'm going to list some of the important ideas. You'll get actually some of the ideas. So that's the idea. Okay. So I want to talk about things like this. How are they similar? How is fraud detection, how does that have anything to do with the flight management system, right? How are they related? So we're going to talk about that. What methods do they use? How do they work? Who designs them? How does that, you know, when they fail, how does that happen? And why do they fail? And how do they fail? That's interesting. And then finally, I'm just going to end with some ideas about, like, you know, where is this going, right? So, okay. So let's jump in. So this is all about optimization. And so the idea is it's mathematical optimization, right? And it just basically says you're going to use mathematics and you're going to use computers to make good decisions or choices, right? And by the way, that makes sense across all of the applications I mentioned, right? So a good choice is you don't flag too many legitimate transactions as fraudulent, and you don't let too many fraudulent transactions go through as legitimate, right? Those are good actions, good decisions. And so this was coined, I mean, someone, I don't even know who coined this, but if they paid, I think it's the OR Society or whatever, but if that's operations research, if they paid a lot of money for it, I actually think this one is actually worth it. So they decided to call this the science of better. And I like it. I mean, so, okay. So the history is that this goes back, this is calculus, right? So, and, you know, if you are a member of the public, you may or may not have been tortured, and that is the correct word, by calculus. Actually, by the way, even those of us with these were tortured by it. So, I mean, so it historically goes back to calculus, right? And so I told you there was going to be an equation. That's it, right? It says there you go. So now, because I think Danny said your budget on equations was 0 or something. So now I've gone over anyway. So, all right. So this is the picture you have. And, you know, if you were tortured with this or not, it's all kind of weird 19th and 18th century stuff with pencil and paper. And besides, it's kind of obvious. No one is ever going to walk up to you on the street and say, hey, you know, I have a 50-foot rope. How should I lay it out to enclose the most area? I mean, duh, that's not going to happen, right? So, okay. So, anyway, this is the traditional and historical picture that you think of when you think about mathematical optimization, okay? You know, you can't make too much fun of it, right? Because, I mean, well, they didn't have computers and all that kind of stuff. So it seems fair, right? Okay. Now, what has emerged is a new style of doing optimization. And it's algorithmic, so it's not about, you know, formulas and writing out, you know, on a chalkboard or something like that. It's algorithmic. You're going to run algorithms on powerful computers that are everywhere. And the other thing is you're going to have a lot of data. So it's not like you simply sit there and, you know, work out some equation and solve it and step back and go, oh, there's the answer or something. That's something from last century or maybe even the century before, right? So this is not that. This is this new style. And if you want some pictures to, you know, to think about that, I mean, historically, you should think about basically the development of computers. So you should think about people like von Neumann and Danzig and stuff. And if you wanted a picture instead of, you know, being tortured by calculus, you should imagine like a data center or something like that. Actually, they don't look like that anymore. They're way more boring than that. What they actually look like, they actually look like just you know, a container, like from that's what they look like, right? So a shipping container, that's actually what they look like. So, okay, but still. And then the other thing is you shouldn't think of like an equation. You should think about programming, because that's actually this new style of thinking. So you actually program things. So, okay. So now I'm actually going to teach you what optimization is. So, and I warned you, but here we go. So I'm going to tell you what it is. And it's actually not that hard. So there's several components of a mathematical optimization problem. So the first thing is there's got to be something that you have to choose. And these are called variables, right? So these are selections or choices to make. It's like, do you assign this surgeon to this OR or to that OR, right? Or which gate should you park at? Or how much power should this particular generator generate tomorrow at between 2 and 2:15 p.m., right? These are the kinds of these are things you have to choose. Okay. You have to have a list of things that you care about that depend on choice. I mean, so you could have lots of things you care about but have nothing to do with the choice, and so they're off the table, right? So that's the idea. And then you need a model of how choices affect the things you care about. So that's actually critical. And there was a talk just yesterday, 24 hours ago, which was all about model-based design. Fit perfectly. But okay. So this is the idea. So you need a model, a mathematical model that at least approximately tells you how your choices affect an outcome and the things you care about. And then finally, you need only one more thing, and that's a description of your preferences among choices. So there, what it means is if I say, here's a portfolio I'm going to invest in, or here's a generator schedule, you have to be able to look at it and say, that's unacceptable, or I like it more than the previous one you showed me. And that's it. That's all you need. It's just these things. Okay. So for generator dispatch, the variables would be the generator powers, right? You'd say that generator's off. That one's going to be operating at 300 megawatts. That's going to be operating at this thing, and so on. So these are the variables. Now, things you care about. You can't ask a generator to generate more than its maximum ability. Actually, you can, but that's another story. Only for a little while. Okay. You can't overload transmission lines. Actually, you can also, but that's yet another story. You have to meet the required demand, right? So if there's a demand and stuff, you have to meet that demand. You care about the total cost of generation, of course, and you care about CO2 emissions, right? So these would be the kinds of things, and there would be other things you'd care about, but this would be a short list of examples. And the model is going to describe this. If I give you, the model will tell you things like, when I turn on various generators at different powers, it'll tell you how the power flows in the network. That's the first thing. And the other thing is it'll tell you what the cost is, and also what the admissions levels are, right? So that's the idea of the model. Okay. When you describe preferences, people just put preferences into two categories. They're not really two categories because it's everything in between. So hard preferences are things that are either like completely unacceptable or completely acceptable, right? So a limit, this could be like imposed by legal limits, sometimes by physics, right? Like when you'd say, for example, for that generator, I would like it to generate negative power. And then you just say, yeah, we don't do that or something, right? It's just not possible. Okay. And then an objective function, that's something that measures the desirability of the choice, right? So that means, it's basically, it's something that tells you how much you like it or dislike it. And in fact, different fields by tradition use one or the other. It doesn't make any difference mathematically, but in fact, different fields use different traditions. So for example, you might minimize a cost function or a loss function. Usually the English word tells you whether it's a good or bad thing, and it's obvious. So minimizing a cost or loss function. So cost function is what engineers would often do. Minimizing a loss function is what people in statistics do, for example. Or you could maximize utility, and these would be our economists or sometimes people in finance. Or it could be just much more direct, like maximize profit. That would be a very common way in a specific application, right? So that's the idea. Now, there's other ways to describe preferences, right? Another way to describe it is by, you could have a prioritized list of things you want, or you could trade off one thing with another, right? These are all, but they're all kind of the same idea. All of these simply describe the preferences. That's all these things do. Okay. So in generator dispatch, your constraints might be you have to respect the limits of the generators. You have to. You can't overload transmission lines, and you have to meet required demands. These are constraints. If you don't do these, it's unacceptable. Okay? And then the objective would be, assuming you can do that, please minimize the total cost of generation, right? That would be one. And another one would be, oh, and by the way, please also minimize the CO2 output generated from your choices, right? And you might end up having something like a trade-off like this. And it says, actually, it turns out there's lots of ways we can actually generate the electricity needed to do, for California tomorrow or something. I mean, this is too small for that, but something like that. There's lots of ways to do it. And they vary in cost in dollars and actually, for example, in CO2 output, right? You could go to a lot of like dirty coal plants and generate a lot of CO2, but it would be cheap, right? Or you could use, natural gas and so on and so forth. Okay, and you might get something that looks like this. Okay, for a trading engine, what do these components look like? The components in optimization. Well, the variables is how much should you buy or sell, and they call it the universe of assets, of your universe of 12,000 assets. How many should you buy or sell? That's the question. Oh, by the way, the answer could well be 0, right? Which just means don't do anything. But that's actually an active answer. The constraints are you would have to respect legal requirements, right? So, for example, if you're a mutual fund, you're not allowed to borrow shares and go, basically go short, which means that you own a negative number of shares. That's legally barred. You might have things like broker requirements. If you do that, you have to put some assets up somewhere else so that if everything goes south, somebody can seize those assets. And the objectives would be things like you want to minimize risk, and you might want to maximize your average return. So this is the idea. And then your model is something, it's a mathematical thing that predicts how these things depend on your trades. That's what it is, right? So that's it. I mean, it gets a little bit more complicated, but frankly, not much. This is pretty much it. Okay. And so with a trading engine, you might have something like this. I might fix a model of how risk and return trade off, and then this would show you a trade-off of risk and return. This would be very, very standard to show, right? Okay. All right. For a spam filter, that's interesting because actually there's no real actions. Well, there is an action. An email is sent into a spam folder or not, right? So there, the variables would be parameters in a statistical model. And the statistical model is basically making a prediction. Is it spam or is it not spam? Okay? And the variables are the parameters in that model. And then the objectives, well, there's just two. You want to minimize the false positive rate. That means an email that's actually legit, but you actually falsely say it's spam, right? That's bad. And the other bad thing that can happen is that you can have a false negative. And that means that something that is actually spam, you say, no, it's not, and it goes into your inbox, right? So that's basically it. There are no other objectives, right? So that's it. And your model then predicts what these two rates are. And you'll have a trade-off. I mean, there's nothing you can do about it. And it might end up looking something like this, right? So you could operate anywhere on that curve, right? You might operate in the middle and give about the same false positive and false negative rate, or you could operate when at another point on that curve. That's the idea. Yeah. Oh, by the way, the Gmail spam filter, it would just look like this because it's essentially perfect, or I'd have to change the axes here. Okay. So, okay. It's now time that we're actually going to do some optimization. So, by the way, now we're going to find out if Danny actually did do that homework. So you should pay attention. Sorry. Okay. Okay. So we're going to do some. What we're going to do is we're going to schedule 200 megawatt hours of generation, and we want to minimize the total cost. And we have 4 generator bids. The first generator will get us up to 110 megawatt hours at $37 per megawatt hour. The next one at 80 will give us up to 80 at $30 and so on. And we want 200. Danny, what do we do? Set up no, you don't set up a constraint equation. Come on, no, come on. Okay, we need to have the first one. Good. So we're going to go all in on the first one, 110. We're 90 short. Keep going. You go to the second cheapest one, and then you're 10 megawatt hours short, and you go to the third cheapest one. Everybody got that? So that is right. Okay, sorry. Sorry to do that to you, but okay, fine. So that's right. You start with the cheapest bids, and you just work up. Okay, that's how it works. Okay. So, by the way, that was not too dramatic, but the truth is, we should actually admit this. Most optimization problems are simple, like this one. It's like if you have one anesthesiologist, free, and you have one surgery scheduled that needs an anesthesiologist, you don't need any fancy computers or anything to figure out exactly what to do, right? Or if 2 people offer you something and one's cheaper than the other, you take the cheaper. I mean, this is pretty simple, right? So, okay. So the truth is, a lot of optimization problems are solved by people just using common sense, right? And this is an example, right? But actually now here is where it gets interesting if you don't know about these things, because this is what's actually cool. So then you could ask, why not have Why not have regular people do this? I mean, why not have common sense stuff? Well, it turns out it gets challenging really quickly, and people start doing really badly. Okay, so for example, just with our generation example, all we're going to do now is say the black dots are going to be our 4 generators. The blue dots are just places where energy is exchanged. And the red squares, those things are actually the loads. Okay? And now it's the exact same problem, but the question is but there's one more subtlety here. Those transmission lines, the lines in between these things, they have maximum capacities. And so now you get into a situation where you have cheap power available, but you're tight on, you can't get it to where it's needed because your transmission lines don't have enough capacity. Everybody got this? So this is, okay. So it turns out people do a really crappy job at this, right? And that's actually even a problem of that size. We've done this as an exercise in a class. People do a pretty crappy job, right? So it turns out problems like this, not only can computers solve things like this, they can solve things with thousands and thousands of generators and, you know, thousands and thousands of transmission lines, and they can do it perfectly always. Some people are probably cringing right now, but okay, fine. Too bad. Okay, so for example, the solution might look something like this. Instead of the obvious thing, which is you go for the cheapest and then you work your way to the second cheapest, it'll turn out you can take most of the cheapest, but you can't take all because you don't have the capacity to deliver it to where it needs to go. And so that would be that, the first one. And on the second one, well, you can take all of it because whatever, it's well connected with transmission lines and so on. Okay, so this is the idea. So the point is, it doesn't take much at all for a human to actually start doing a bad job, and for some, at least in some cases, for computers to be doing a much, 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 much better job, right? Doesn't take much at all. Okay. So now we're going to talk about this. Where do these mysterious models come from? And it's kind of interesting. So first of all, I mean, and here this is an exaggeration. It's a caricature. But they could come from, for example, physics and first principles, right? So that would be, you know, this is an old tradition. Well, it's basically since Newton, right? So this is a very old tradition where you have models, you know, and this would be fine for generator dispatch. Actually, for the way electricity flows on transmission lines, we actually know how that works, like, really well. And it's completely repeatable. We know very well. There's a few things we don't know, and it's where we can make predictions that are within, you know, 0.5%. Okay, so that we know. How planes fly and things like that. We know that really well. How circuits work. We know these things really well. Okay. But for spam, right, there's no fundamental theory of spam. There's no Newton's equations. There's no physics of spam, right? That's not what it is. I mean, spam is a bunch of people in Russia have taken over Windows machines that people have all over the world and use that to send email. I mean, that's what it is. So there is no fundamental theory of it, right? Okay. Now, at the other end, to create a model, you have things like data fitting, right? And that means that you're going to look at a whole bunch of data, and then from that data, you're going to create a model. Actually, what's nice about the data fitting is usually when it's done, no one has any weird ideas like a physicist might. They don't trust their model, because, I mean, duh, they just made it up. It's like if you go to Google and you talk to the people who made the Gmail spam filter, and you'd say, oh, did you crack it by working out the deep inner workings of the fundamentals of spam? And they're like, no, we did good machine learning. And then they said, do you think it's perfect? And they'd say, no, of course not. So there wouldn't be anything. You know, whereas people in physics would say, how good is your model? And they go, it's perfect. It's the way the world works, right? So I know people who say that. Actually, the most irritating people about those people is they're right. It's awful, yeah. So, okay, fine. Okay, so how do you fit the parameters in a model? Actually, weirdly, you use optimization. I'm not going to talk about that, but it starts getting weird and circular. So, okay. So here's the thing. These are very different modeling styles, and they're used it's a source of huge tension and confusion, right? So if you translate someone from one model style and drop them into a community where they use another one, either a fight could break, something terrible could happen, or a disaster, right? So you take a physicist used to actually really working on the way the world works, and you drop them into, oh, let's say a hedge fund, and bad things can happen. Oh, except my friends say, That's why they like applied physicists or experimental physicists, because they know the models aren't exactly right. It's the other ones you have to watch out for. Okay, so different applications, they use different model styles. And by the way, most of the people, if they're usually fairly isolated, and they think their model style is the only one. And they actually, that's why I've watched conversations where there's people who actually cannot communicate, right? You'll have an electrical engineer who uses models that we know perfectly, right? Or an aerospace engineer talking to someone who does online advertising, right? And they're just from different worlds, right? You know, they just don't, they can't even talk to each other. Okay, so first principle models would be things like spacecraft dynamics, Newtonian mechanics, right? These things we know really well. Electricity transmission. And these are expressed as equations. By the way, they usually have some 19th century name associated with them, right? Or earlier in the case of Newton, right? And the idea is there's some very nice things about these models. I mean, you can often trust them. I mean, not always, by the way, but you can often trust them. And then also you can assemble them to make a model of something bigger. And this is a style that people do. Okay. Model fitting, you know, the picture associated with it is this. I mean, it depends, again, you may have been tortured with this in some class, some math class or whatever. But the idea is, you know, you're making a fit, an approximation to some data, right? So in the classic case is like a best fit line or a regression line to some data, right? So the blue dots might be some data, and then your green line is your model. By the way, that model has two parameters in it, the height and the slope, right? So this has two parameters. Now in real applications, the number of parameters, you can't plot things, and the number of parameters used ranges from hundreds to millions, actually to billions. Okay, so people make models with billions of parameters, right? So, which is crazy, but they do. Okay. And this data fitting stuff is unbelievably important because it's the key to working in a field where there aren't first principle models. There aren't first principle models for spam, right? Or for advertising. There just is no such thing, and looking for it is just wrong, and it's not going to help. But this allows you, if you have a place where you can get data, get your hands on data, you can make a model. And the nice thing also is when you do this, you're already a bit humble because you don't imagine that your model is actually the way the world really is. It's just a model from the data, right? So, okay. So now what I'm going to talk about is a couple of things like basically what can go wrong. This is, so let me say about what can go wrong. Well, either go wrong or what are some pitfalls, right? So the first one is, I mean, so usually when if I teach a class, I do teach a class on this, and, you know, all the students get all excited and everything. I tell them they should expect this, that what will happen is after a week, they'll wake up one day and they'll go like, oh my God, everything is an optimization. Like everything is an optimization problem, right? And which is true. But we'll get to the punchline on that one momentarily, right? So, but the question is, can you solve it, right? Other things that can come up is things you forgot to specify. I'll say something about that. And then the worst one is bad models. So trigger warning if people work in some of these fields. There'll be some upsetting things. But I'll warn you right before it happens. Right, so, okay. So, all right. So the first thing is, these students get all excited and they go like, that's awesome, that's amazing. Like everything is optimized. Like every field, you can't even think of one that's not. Okay, fine, okay. The question then is, can you solve it, right? And it turns out the answer, I'll give you the executive summary on that one. The answer is no, you can't. So it's a little bit depressing, right? But it turns out there are enough problems that you can actually solve and that actually occur that there are things you can do. Also, you can kind of do a crappy job of solving it, and that's what most people do, and they just they don't talk about it in public, right? So, oh, sorry, this is a public lecture. Sorry, so I shouldn't say. Okay, fine. So the idea is you can have simple problems, simple things that look simple, but they're really hard. And you can have problems that are really hard, that look really hard, right? Like, you know, scheduling 3,100 generators on transmission lines and all sorts of crazy stuff. And it turns out, even though it sounds unbelievably complicated, a human being could never even come close to doing it. It's easy for a computer to do, okay? So, and anyway, so I mean, that's actually what my research is about. Well, I'm not going to say anything more about that, but that's the idea. Okay. I want to talk about another pitfall is things you forgot to specify. Okay? So in optimization, you have to say exactly what you want. And in fact, one wonderful thing, one nice side effect of using optimization is it forces you to articulate what you want. Also, it forces you to articulate what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, right? And so, but you have to specify it. You have to tell it that's a constraint or that's an objective, right? Another way to say it is, these optimization solvers, this is just a bunch of code that runs on a computer. They have absolutely no common sense. If you forgot to tell it, if you told it that one generator has zero cost because you forgot to say that it had any cost at all, it's going to go, not a problem. And it'll just schedule it all the way up, right? If you forgot to tell it about some other constraint, it's going to do something and you're going to go, oh my God, that's terrible. Don't you have any common sense? And the answer is they don't, right? So I put it another way. I blame the user when this happens. By the way, this happens to me several times a year. I'm in a situation where I'm somewhere and they say, oh, we tried optimization. No, you know, it was like, but it makes no sense, right? The idea is, I would say to them, you have absolutely no right to complain about the decisions on the basis of something you didn't specify. So if you walk up to a generator schedule and you go, oh, no, that's unacceptable, it relies way too much on generator number 2. You're like, well, dude, you didn't tell it anything. If that's the way you feel about it, then let's put a constraint in there that says don't rely too much on generator 2. Anyway, so, or another one, a hedge fund person could look at a portfolio and go, oh, that's not diversified enough. Well, then go ahead. Put in something that says something that will force diversification. Okay, so, okay. And the final one, and this is the bad one, bad models. So the point about this is when you make one of these models, sometimes they're very accurate, right? When we predict power flow in a network, we're at the 0.5% level, okay? When you design a circuit, we can predict those things at the 5% or 1% level. I mean, so you could, some of these things, you know, when you have if you have an airplane, you know, or something like that, we can predict things really well in those cases, right? In other cases, that's not the case, right? Or as a friend of mine in economics says, we're happy when we get the sign right. So, that's yeah. Oh, by the way, the postscript on that is, if you get the sign right repeatedly or, you know, regularly, not even all the time, you can actually make a lot of money. But that's another story. So it's okay. So you have a model, and it's never exactly right. I mean, we know that, right? It could be 1% right. It could be 10% right. It could be something that's right occasionally enough, right? But whatever it is, it's going to ignore all sorts of effects and terms and things. And the other thing is the model can change with time, smoothly or abruptly. If you're doing mathematical advertising, you're making a model of what people want or whether or not a person is going to click on something. Tastes evolve over time, okay? Now, the other thing is if you make an economic model about something, these change. You know, these things can change. There can be some crisis that will set something off, and things will change drastically, right? So, okay. Now, if you're lucky, everything just works, right? You made a model based on this thing, you optimized it, and then you carry out those actions and you see what happens. And if it works well, that's great. It often does just work well. That's fine. But if not, you know, bad things can happen, right? So here's a quick example, is I create a portfolio from some assets that I'm allowed to invest in, and I make it, and my model says that my distribution of possible returns I'm going to make at the end of the year looks like this thing here, right? I mean, this is more, it's actually not made up, but it's close to made up, right? So you look at it, but the real things look exactly like this. So you look at that, and what it says is, you know, you're probably going to make 7%. If you're lucky, you could make 10. Even 14 is plausible, right? There's a very small probability of a loss. Okay? So you look at this and you go, that's fantastic. Thank you for introducing this idea of optimization to me or something, right? But what happens is the models are not quite right, and so this might be what you get with the real model. And this would be the kind of thing you'd expect. And so you'd say, okay, well, what this tells you is that, you know, your forecast is now it's more likely you're going to make 6% than 7. And now, guess what? There's a small but much bigger probability that there's a loss. Okay? So, by the way, this is the good outcome. Okay? This is what happens if you're lucky, and this is typically what happens. Okay. But this can also happen, right? And what that means is, you know, you made a model, you did this optimization stuff, told you to allocate assets in some weird way, and you did it. And then it says, turns out your model was not quite right, but those small errors were enough to completely change the outcome. And actually what happened was, congratulations, you just used all sorts of high technology to lose a lot of money. So this is the idea, right? So, okay. Now this is part of the general garbage in, garbage out idea, right? If your models or data become wrong, or become wrong, then the results of the optimization is useless, right, basically. Actually, or much worse. So long-term capital management is, a famous disaster where, people believed the model too much. They were physicists incidentally, or I should say not incidentally. And, they just believed the model too well, and next thing you know, there was some crisis somewhere, and I forget what the losses were, but they were spectacular, right? Oh, and what happens is after that happens, optimization gets a bad name in that field, right? So I've talked to many people who say, oh, we tried optimization. Boy, that didn't work out. And it's like, to me, that doesn't make any sense. That means basically we did a crappy job of optimization. And of course it didn't work out. So, okay. Now, just on the positive side, I should say this. Good practitioners always check if the results are sensitive to the model. Always. Always, right? So in all those fields, things are tested carefully. So just so you know. And there's even methods to make the model, do the optimization in such a way that it's actually okay when the parameters change, right? So, okay. All right. So this is actually from an actual hedge fund that my student worked at. So this is some very sophisticated trading engine. It's doing the kind of stuff we've been talking about, and it's going along here. And it's, it goes several years, and, the annualized risk, that's the variation in how much they make each day. It's around 10% or something like that. It goes up to 11, down to 4. And this is what happens during the quant crunch, right? So it goes up by, a factor of, I don't know, whatever it is, 12 or 20 or something like that. Oh, by the way, this image, if you know people work in hedge funds or something, that's their worst nightmare right there. So if anyone here who does this kind of stuff, I apologize. I'm sorry for showing this to you. Sorry. Actually, I said I was going to warn you. I didn't, but now I'm apologizing for showing it to you. But so the point is here, this is a model that just went bad. Okay? So this is one of the bad things that can happen. Okay. Next topic is recourse. It's our last topic, and then I'll wrap up. The idea of recourse is this. So far, I've been talking about the idea of just making one choice, based on a model and some preferences and things like that. But in a lot of cases, you're making a sequence of choices at different times. And every time you make another choice, new data is available. You might have better models available. You might have all sorts of stuff. Or your goals have changed. So all sorts of things you can do this way, right? So this is the idea of recourse. This idea has lots of names in different fields. In fact, including in some fields where people would be mutually unintelligible. They wouldn't even be able to speak to each other mostly. Sometimes it's called dynamic optimization, optimization with recourse, multi-stage optimization, feedback control. That's what this conference is about. Or intelligent agent. That's the AI people describe it exactly. I mean, literally, it's the exact definition. And I'd say, what do you call that? And they'd say, that's called intelligent agent. I'm like, well, I think we call it control. And they're like, well, good for you. So, okay. So a lot of people do this. Okay. But the idea is, this is very interesting. And now this is going to be the flip side of the bad news about bad models. I'm going to tell you something about it, actually. It's the dirty secret of control, which I will tell you shortly, right? So the idea is that when you do this multi-stage optimization, what happens is if you re-optimize using new information, it turns out even if you were slightly wrong, you're going to correct the errors. Okay? So in our examples, you had recourse, you can imagine what it is, right? So generator dispatch, you get updated demand predictions, right? So instead of figuring everything out at midnight, now it's 15 minutes away from 2:15 p.m., and you can make a much better prediction of how much power you're going to need, okay? In a trading engine, you could look at the realized performance and have updated things like that. Okay. There's a standard scheme for all this. It's very simple, and what it does, it's actually extremely natural, and I'll just tell you exactly what it is. It's used in lots and lots of fields, but has lots of different names too. The idea is what you do, every time you make a decision, what you do is you make predictions for future unknown things, right? So in the supply chain, you predict what various things are going to be, what the demand is at various places, you predict what the supply level at a warehouse is, 5 days from now. You have no idea. You just make a prediction, okay? And then what you do is you use optimization to form a plan of action. And so this is a sequence of things that you're going to execute. And then here's the trick. You simply execute according to that plan, except you can preempt. You can preempt. And preempt means when new information comes in, you can re-optimize. And so that's the idea. So this is used in tons of these fields, different names, mutually. I asked someone in revenue management, what do you call this? He looked at me and he said, I think we call that revenue management. Because it's just so obvious, right? I mean, everybody does this, right? So, okay. I'll show you a quick example here. It's about rolling horizon generator dispatch. And then after that, I'll tell you one of the dirty secrets of our field. Sorry to those with this, to reveal it in public. One of our, okay, so here it is. This is something where, the red is the generator stuff, that's stuff in the past. Everything to the left of the first vertical bar is stuff that's actually happened. Everything to the right is sort of not in the horizon, and you're planning over the horizon. The green, the blue, shows you what the actual demand is going to be, but you don't know that because that's in the future, right? The green shows you your prediction, and now I'll tell you one of the dirty secrets. The dirty secret is you can do a pretty crappy job with these predictions if you have recourse, right, if you keep replanning. And so what happens now is you plan for this. Notice these predictions are not particularly good, and then you just march forward in time. You're making these predictions. Now, it's much more than you think, and you adapt. And this goes on like this. So this is used, this idea that, you would imagine this would work. It's easy to think this is going to work if those predictions are really good. What's amazing is if they're plus minus 50%, you still get things that work really well. Okay? So that's the flip side of the bad models are going to kill you problem, right? This is the good news about it, is if you have recourse, you can have bad models. In fact, that's kind of a quick summary of what control is. Okay. I'm going to wrap up now. And the first thing I want to say is something actually sort of, it's anthropological, right? It's about something interesting to me about what's happening among academics and stuff like that. And it's not just academics having a lot of impact in a lot of areas. What it is what's really emerging is a new applied math. Now, unfortunately, applied math already means something, and it's something different, right? So you don't say applied math because it means something else. And the idea is it uses model fitting from data. It's often statistically motivated. It's algorithmic and computationally oriented. And this is done in many departments, like computer science, electrical engineering, statistics, operations research. It's not quite data science, right? Although I would put that under this umbrella easily. But it's in a lot of different areas. It's this new field. Oh, by the way, anybody notice a department that's missing from that list? If it's applied math. Oh, oops, the math department doesn't know about it. That's fine. By the way, I'm allowed to say those things because I was originally in math. So, okay, fine. And I won't say anything more about that. So, all right. It's applied in lots of different areas, right? I mean, that's actually what's kind of cool about it, right? So, and what it really does is it kind of puts the smart in systems and products, right? When something just happens the right way, and you're thinking, how did they know that? It's probably something like this operating on the back end, right? Okay. So the question is, where's it going? And by the way, I'll be happy to tell you right now my answer. My answer is I have no idea where it's going. But we'll just talk about a few things, right? So the first thing, this part I do know. I do know this. This is only going to get more and more pervasive. I mean, because what's happening is, computers are getting better, sensors are getting better. You get access to more and more data, this crazy stuff. And you're going to be hearing a lot about these things in the future. And the most disturbing part is that some of it is actually going to be true, what you hear. So, I mean, most of it won't be, but some is going to be, okay? So, it's already here and it's coming, right? You have self-driving cars, you have drones, smart grids, smart appliances, all sorts of other stuff. And a lot of other things, I mean, some good and some bad, right? And a question is, like, what's a world filled with smart systems going to look like, right? By the way, this is about the time when I start explaining, what is it, the singularity? No, I'm joking. It's ridiculous. Anyway, but there are people who would. So let me start with just what are the benefits, right? The benefits are something like this. This is the best way it can work, is devices and services are just going to get, like, faster, cheaper, cleaner, safer, more reliable, more efficient, like car engines, right? And you don't care, and you don't actually, this is the way it should be. It should be, no one should really see this. You should just get a car every 10 years, and it's going to be way cleaner, right? I mean, that's the way it should be, right? Or other stuff you don't even think about, like why did the lights come on, right? How did that happen? Actually, there's some very important things there which will affect people. I mean, not really, but one is it'll actually allow you to extend the infrastructure life, right? So if you put in some transmission lines or something like that in the 50s and based it on some idea of what it's going to look like in the 80s, we're already 35 years past that. What happens is if you're actually using the resources more efficiently, you don't have to plan for the peak, right? And so you can actually, it's got all sorts of things. Now, the other thing, there's going to be cool stuff, just stuff you can't even imagine is going to be done. And I'm going to finish with some bad stuff. Just, it's not all good. Well, it doesn't have to be bad. So the first one is security. I have a colleague who gives talks about this. It's absolutely terrifying what he talks about. I mean, this is for so-called smart devices, right? So it's terrible. It's terrible right now. They can currently be hacked. Here's another one, lack of privacy. You're being tracked, all of you, all of us. Everywhere you go, you're being tracked, right? So is that good or bad? I don't know, but it's kind of weird, right? Loss of jobs. That's completely real, right? So, there's no doubt that robots and other stuff and other things that were done by people or, Bob, who used to sit in the back room and schedule trucks, we're not going to need Bob anymore, okay? And so it's going to happen. There's a muddling of accountability and liability, right? So we've already had, actually, people kept talking about when is going to be the first fatality with a self-driving car, and it happened, okay? So it already happened. Who do you blame? I don't know who to blame or what. So, and finally, I'll mention something else. You can be outsmarted. So I started the talk by telling you about the California Independent System Operator that built this very clever system that schedules generators for tomorrow in California and minimizes the cost and CO2 and blah, blah, blah. Well, guess what? J.P. Morgan, they built a smarter trading engine that traded exactly those things. And the result was J.P. Morgan's trading engine, submitted bids and did things and got contracts and ran generators that did nothing more than suck billions of dollars out of California, benefiting absolutely no one but themselves. In fact, it's even worse than that. The result, what they did ended up, which by the way was more or less legal, except they just fell down laughing when they had a judgment of $500 million, and they were like, oh, sure, no problem here. So anyway, it was quasi-legal. It actually, there's substantial evidence that what they did actually generated more CO2 and certainly cost a lot more to California consumers, like me. I paid for it. But boy, they did really well. So, okay. So I don't want to leave a slide here, which is depressing, so I'm going to go back to this one. And now I'm going to quit. So, and I'd be very happy to take questions or something like that if you want. So.
Stephen? I know how to pick good speakers, right? So are there questions for Stephen? Please come up and use a microphone so it gets recorded.
So I'm one in the audience. It does have a badge here. So.
Yes. Okay. I know who you are.
Speaking for the public, did control engineers design the elevator system here?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I'll explain the internal joke. The hotel here has these new elevators, which is an example of a so-called smart product. I don't know if it's better or worse. But put it this way, it could have been J.P. Morgan that designed the elevator, in which case I think the ones we have in there are better than the ones J.P. Morgan would design. That'll be my answer. Okay.
Questions?
Hi, Steve. I don't know if you heard about people complaining about machine learning systems being racist because they were designed by white men like you.
With what?
Being racist, allegedly giving racist answers because they were designed by white men like you.
Yep.
So I was wondering, how would you respond to the public for that?
Yeah. So I mean, things like that happen, and it's not good. And it means you have to explicitly you have to be very careful when you're designing these things to make sure things like that don't happen, right? There's also gender neutrality issues, right? So I have friends who type stuff in or correct things, and it's always like a she gets corrected to a he. And then she comes in, and well, it's a neighbor of ours, and then she comes to me and she says, hey, people like you designed that. That's terrible. Why doesn't it know I'm a woman? And I'm like, sorry, it must be that statistically people who match that would be men. Anyway, she didn't think it was funny. But yeah, so that's a real issue. Yeah, so actually there's a big movement now to be very aware of that when you design these things. So.
Thank you. So for those of us who don't want to be members of the public anymore, should we be fortunate enough that you would teach Convex Optimization 1 online through the, I believe, Honors Cooperative Program, Stanford office?
Oh, so I didn't get most of that. What was it?
There's, to my understanding, there's an online offering that Stanford has, Honors Cooperative Program through the Center for Professional Development or something like this. Would you be the professor for, is it EE3? I can't recall the course number, for Convex Optimization 1?
So I should say, hopefully, my goal is to make these things very easy for actually to have the ideas widely disseminated and to have them easy to use. So let's just say we're working on it.